Okay, hello everybody. Welcome to another episode of Beyond the Abstracts. And today I'm here with Lienhard Legenhausen. Thank you very much for joining me today. I'll have introduced you briefly in the text accompanying the show, but could you give a kind of introduction to who you are?
As you said, my name is Lienhard Legenhausen. I'm an emeritus of Münster University in Germany, where I was responsible for language learning and language teaching, actually language acquisition research. My background, I underwent teacher training in the late 60s, when pattern practice was still the order of the day, and the best road towards successful language learning. I wanted to become a teacher of English, and since our system requires two subjects, my first subject was English, and the second subject, believe it or not, was physical education. However, after a couple of months at a German grammar school, Gymnasium we call it, I ended up at the University of Stuttgart in southern Germany, at an Institute of Linguistics. And this Institute of Linguistics focused actually on applied linguistics, and that included language teaching methodology. That's where I became familiar with the latest developments in communicative language teaching, as defined by Chris Candlin in England, Eberhard Pifo in Germany. So I thought I knew how to teach languages best. Why I'm saying this? Because later on I had to revise my opinions. I was absolutely sure I knew how to go about it. And then I got to know a woman called Leni Dam. And that was pure accident. At the university, I was responsible for introducing a test of English for our students. And by chance, the British Council offered a seminar on the latest developments in language testing, and I applied for it. The British Council seminar on testing was cancelled, and that's what I was interested in. And instead, they said, why don't you attend the seminar on computer-assisted language learning? And I was not at all interested in computer-assisted language learning at that time, but they said, well, but it includes testing as well. So I reluctantly accepted it. And when I say reluctantly, I really mean it. And at that seminar, the director of studies was Jeff Leach, and that was, of course, a big name, and that's why I said, yes, I'll attend. And and at that seminar, I met Leni Dam, and, well, we discussed her views on language learning and teaching. And I said, what crazy ideas. I mean, I don't believe you. And then she said, as a side remark, well, why don't you come and see my classes? And since the school was near Copenhagen, and Copenhagen is an attractive tourist city, I agreed. And so I visited her classes. The very first lesson I attended, there was a seat next to Dennis, empty seat. And Leni said, why don't you take place next to Dennis? And Dennis was a difficult student. He was working on his own, which was a bit unusual, but many classmates didn't want to work with Dennis, at least at that time. So I sat next to him, and I was watching what he was doing. I couldn't believe my eyes. He was copying sentences from a textbook that is a page on fill-in exercises. And all the gaps were already filled in. And he just copied stupid, unrelated sentences. And I walked up to Lynn and said, well, how have you seen this? Yeah, she said, why not? If he wants to do that, let him do it. It's fine with me. I was, I must admit, shocked. Gradually, I learned what was going on in that classroom. And it all ended up in a 4-year research project. I returned to this class for the next 4 years, and even later, other classes. So that is the beginning of, becoming familiar also with ideas of autonomous language learning.
Right, and we met a few kind of key characters from the story there, like Leni, and then Dennis is another name that's familiar to me, but maybe we can kind of get into that a bit more later. You, just backing up a second, you said that you were surprised by the approach that she was taking in her class, and then at the start of our conversation, you mentioned your own teacher training in the 1960s. I'm guessing there was some kind of gap there between your training and what you were seeing in this classroom. Could you develop that a bit more?
What was that? In the meantime, I was teaching at the university and also methodology classes. And but apart from methodology classes, also linguistics, English linguistics.
Okay.
So that's my background, actually. But I was interested in, so that is actually my main research interest, the development of learner languages. And it all started with my PhD thesis, where I analyzed 26,000 errors made by German students in their final state exam. We call it Abitur, some kind of A-level exam. That was the beginning of getting interested in how do learner languages develop. Jeff Leach's seminar on computer-assisted language learning later on also got me interested in the computers in foreign language learning. And together with Dieter Wolf, we started many research projects on the computer in the language classroom. And I was actually fascinated by what, for example, concordancing programs can do in the hands of learners. So that was also one of my research interests before I became involved with autonomous language learning.
I see. So development of learner languages and kind of application of computers to that. Sure. Yes. So, and then you had this experience actually getting to sit in on Leni Dam's class, and it sounds like it was kind of revolutionary to you. And actually today, this is kind of the focus of our conversation, is to discuss a couple of chapters from this landmark book that you co-authored, which is Language Learner Autonomy Theory, Practice and Research from 2017. So it was published by you with David Little and Leni Dam, published by Multilingual Matters. It's a very impactful book. I've read it cover to cover and I enjoyed it immensely. I've been talking a lot about it recently as well. But in particular today, I want to narrow in on chapters 5 and 6, which is kind of the evidence part behind the book. And we'll meet this character Dennis again later on. But just starting with the chapter number 5, let me begin by asking the question in a kind of seemingly simplistic way. Does autonomy work?
This is, of course, the crucial question. Whenever I'm involved in inset courses, whenever I go to conferences and there are teachers, does it work? We don't believe you. So the only way to convince teachers was to show that this kind of approach is highly successful. But the problem is, of course, how do you prove that it is highly successful? So the beginning was that I thought, well, we have to compare it to some other classes working along traditional lines. Traditional lines, I mean the mainstream communicative approach to language learning and teaching, as I said, as defined by Chris Cairns and Hans Ewald Pifo and others. And fortunately enough, one of my colleagues at the university was a teacher of English and a teacher trainer who was also starting his so-called beginners classes at the same time when Leni did. It was just pure accident. There were two teacher trainers starting their classes at the same time, and both, as I said, both very experienced teachers. Both have published widely in their corresponding methodologies. So that was the beginning of doing this long-term research. You know, how do the German learners fare, and how do English autonomous learners pick up the language?
So yes, you are kind of getting into the topic of the project here with these two teachers, these two groups. So they're a German class and a Danish class, is that right? And this is part of the, I never know how to read this. It's LALE, L-A-A-L-E. How do you say?
Well, we call it LALE. Language Acquisition in an Autonomous Learning Environment. Yes. Okay,
can you give us a bit of an overview of the LALE project, like how it came to be and what it entailed exactly?
Well, the basic idea was to follow this class over a longer period of time. Because I'm very skeptical of one-off studies, you know, when you walk into the classroom for 2 weeks and then do some tests and then draw far-reaching conclusions from that. A long-term project was the main idea. And, well, this was a marvelous opportunity for me as a university teacher to work with a teacher for that period of time, with two teachers even for a long period of time. The basic idea was, though, what kind of data collection procedures would be fair to all students, to the German students as well as to the Danish students. So that was some kind of challenge. So we decided to approach our subject from various angles. So we used many different data collection techniques. We used structured tests. We used vocabulary recall questionnaires. We used C tests. I don't know if everybody is familiar with C tests, redundancy tests. We used, and especially we used these dyadic conversations, peer-to-peer talks, and that's what our main findings are based on.
So you... Sorry, go ahead.
No, I mean, this is what I can say about it. That's about it.
So you've made this kind of very deliberate choice to benchmark the study against these different kinds of language change measures that you've got there, and definitely taking a longitudinal approach. I'm hearing that you wouldn't be interested in a short-term one-off study. So those are the main measures in LALE. The book doesn't mention any of these kind of questionnaires that you frequently see in the literature that talk about measuring a learner autonomy through some kind of self-report or something. Could you talk a little bit about that choice?
Well, when it comes to questionnaire data, I am, to be honest, a bit skeptical about the validity of questionnaire data. You know, people claim what they're doing, and then when you compare it to what they're actually doing, then there is a discrepancy. So that's why we would not use full-fledged questionnaire data. Although we did, of course, ask students when it comes to self-assessments, you know, but it's not a full-fledged questionnaire approach. But we try to rely on data from various angles. As I said, also C-test data, apart from conversational data that we transcribed.
Okay.
And
so
people always asking, does it?
yes, the doesn't work part.
She said, there is no explicit grammar teaching. They said, no, there isn't. They don't know what the do support question is. But how do they acquire language without explicit instruction? I thought, well, they just do. And when I talk about the successes of that approach, I tend to quote one of my student assistants. He was responsible for transcribing peer-to-peer talks after 4 years of English. And at one stage, he walked up to me and said, how many native speakers are involved in this project? I said, there are none. So this just goes to show how excellent the results were after 4 years of English.
Wow. Okay, so that's quite convincing. So it's not taking this kind of self-reported opinion type data. You're just going after the language change there. Okay, so that I can see that might be convincing to any of these teachers that come and ask you, does it work? Because they're interested in the change, right? Whether you see that.
But there was also some criticism. How can you compare two different learning settings? There are German learners, there are Danish learners. You can't compare them. We tried hard to make it as comparable as possible, you know, as I said, by having these experienced teachers. But the status of English in Denmark is, of course, different to the status of English in Germany. To characterize it in some rough terms, in Denmark, English has got the status almost of an L2. In Germany, it's still a foreign language. So they have that television, they do not dub English films. The Germans dub English films. So how can you compare that? So that is a valid criticism, of course. And we would never, ever claim anything as to the generalizability of our findings. It was just some kind of reference point we needed. Since there were no external measures of comparability, what is actually needed is a replication of our approach. We tried hard to find teachers anywhere in the world, but we haven't found them. It's difficult.
Stars aligned for this particular project, right? With the two teachers that were very experienced and had the time at the same time, right? I can see. So
the German, if I tell the German teachers, wow, the Danish group is a mixed ability group, and we compare them to learners from a German Gymnasium, a grammar school. And at that time, only about, less than 40% of a year attend a grammar school of that type. And they all intend to do university studies. And we compare this selective group of learners with a Danish mixed ability group. with learners like Dennis and Susan. Okay, that's an important point that really convinced some of them, at least.
Right. No, and the fact that it's takes place over a period of 4 years as well. The consistency is quite convincing. Let's dig into the specifics a bit more, because when I read the 5th chapter, there's this kind of debate comes up a lot. Explicit instruction versus, as you mentioned before, implicit acquisition. Like they just learn by doing this. So can you walk us through a little bit more the detail of the results? So what were the changes in vocabulary that you saw, or in grammar, or pragmatic competence is another thing that's mentioned in the chapter. And then also in their self-evaluations that you saw. Could you walk us through each of those in turn?
Yes, we started our series of data collection with vocabulary. And what we did, we collected all the words that came up in the autonomous classroom in the first 4 weeks. So what words showed up on posters, what words did the learners use in word cards, and so on. And the total collection of words amounted to 400 words. This does not imply that they have learned these words, but 400 words became public in the autonomous language classroom in the first 4 weeks. Now, what does that imply, 400 words? I checked the textbook that the German learners were using, how many words were introduced in the first 4 weeks. And the number of words amounted to 187. Then I looked, what does the German syllabus say about vocabulary learning? So in the first year, so after 12 months of learning English, the German learners were supposed to know 800 words. So 400 words had already become public in the first 4 weeks in the autonomous classroom. Well, but to what extent have they actually also learned these words? And so we did recall tests after another period of time, I think after that 30 weeks or so. And it turned out that the Danish learners had still remembered or still could recall about, well, up to 90% of all these words.
Wow.
How come that they were so successful as regards vocabulary learning? My hypothesis is that they are more aware of the words around them, the English words around them, and they can activate them in the classroom. The German learners only activated textbook words, although English is also around in their daily life, perhaps even to a greater extent than in Denmark, at least what you see in advertisements, etc., etc. So that was already very, very, very convincing. And in this vocabulary, in these tests, we also included a Danish class. Same school, same students with the same demographic background. And again, the autonomous class excelled when compared to the Danish
I
class.
see.
I mean, that was something that was really, really convincing.
Okay, so same context, but
Same
different teaching approach.
Same cohort of learners.
I see. Okay, so this is their kind of passive recall of vocabulary. And then you also tested their ability to use the vocabulary as well.
Yes, yes, yes. And another reason why they recalled the words to a much greater extent than the German group, I think the words that they learned, that were words that they were actually interested in. That is, that they could relate. They could relate to these words that they introduced. later on we will talk about Dennis. So the first couple of words that Dennis used included hammer and saw. He was an 11-year-old young learner. Later on, it turned out that Dennis had his own carpentry firm.
Oh.
I find this so fantastic.
Right.
So in the very first lessons of English, he learned hammer and saws, and 10 years later, I don't know how many years later, he set up his own firm in carpentry.
Right. And these words are just more salient because they are relevant to the interests of the individual.
Interest, right, actually.
Rather than chosen by some syllabus designer somewhere based on a word frequency list.
Yes. The words that I think I've mentioned that, the words that the German learners recorded were all textbook words. They did not include the words around them that they were actually familiar with. If I had given them clues, look around, go into shops and see what the English words are around in the daily life. They didn't do that.
Okay, so this is the vocabulary size.
Yes.
We're talking about here. Okay, and so another aspect was grammar, changes in the grammar. Can you talk a bit about that?
Yes. The biggest surprise to me was that the German learners had practiced the difference between past and present perfect forms. Okay. They had practiced even the functional difference between be going to and will future forms. These were the grammatical chapters that they had spent the last weeks on. When looking at the peer-to-peer talks, they never, ever used these forms. Whenever they wanted to refer to the future, they used present tense. And the Danish learners were excellent when using be going to forms. That was one, perhaps for me, the most surprising form. But coming back to, I mentioned to-do support questions. It's a difficult grammatical chapter for our German students, but should also be, should cause the same problem to Danish learners. And when I compare the statistics on to-do support sentences, the result was, and that was a surprise to me, almost identical. The Germans use them as in as many contexts correctly as the Danish learners, and made was. But then it struck me that these German learners, in every second sentence, used either the verb to like or to live. These were textbook phrases. Where do you live? What do you like?
Okay. Parroting.
So nasty as I was, I detracted all the sentences with live and like. And suddenly accuracy rates for the German learners dropped drastically from 70 so and so many percent to less than 60%. Whereas the Danish accuracy rates didn't drop at all.
So this is, you're looking at their conversational use. These are the dyadic conversations that you mentioned before. Okay, right. I see.
Yes. So what the German learners try to do in these conversations is memorize chunks that they have learned. It's the result of rote learning.
Right.
Because very interesting. Next to each other, one learner says, ask the silly question, where do you live? Because they know where they live. Where do you live? And the next sentence is, when arrives your bus? So when does the school bus arrive? So this coexistence of these two forms, the standard form, where do you live, that they have practiced for hours on end, and where live you, when comes your bus? So this is also indicative of the fact that this classroom, which is based on a suspension of disbelief, which where do as if activities dominate, this is the result, that they can't.
Right.
Yeah.
They can't reproduce. They can't reproduce in any meaningful way, going beyond merely mimicking the right.
Transfer happens to a very, very limited extent only.
I see. Right. Okay. All right. So we've covered vocabulary, size, and ability to use grammar. So the Danish class outperformed the German class on both measures here. The next topic in the chapter is about pragmatic competence. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yes. When you look at the literature, there is unanimous agreement that pragmatic competence cannot be taught in a foreign language classroom. And what does pragmatic competence consist of? Do you adhere, say, to politeness principles?
Mm-hmm.
Do you actually listen attentively to what someone is doing and can pick up on what he has said? Can you support your partners during his turn? Questions like that. And also, to what extent do these learners refer to common background knowledge? For example, in the Danish classes, learners say, well, do you remember this or that? Or have you heard this or that? That they try to define a common knowledge basis.
Mm-hmm.
Nothing of this happens within the English classroom. So these authentic social interactions, which leads to communicative competence, also imply a pragmatic dimension.
I see.
This comes back. They also use gambits. Like that. Yeah. But
it sounds like they were more successful at kind of establishing a class culture in a way there, so they have a shared history and a shared resource to draw upon in there.
Yes. Right.
Okay, so that's 3 areas of their language change that you measured. And then the other topic mentioned in the chapter is crucial to autonomy and to all teaching, which is assessment, right? How do you assess change? And in particular, I think you were interested in the reliability of their assessments of their own language change versus those judgments that the teachers had made. So could you talk a little bit about that?
Yes. We used 3 measurements. How do Danish learners assess their competence, their writing competence and their oral competence? How does the teacher assess it? On a scale 1 to 10, or I don't know what we used. And I used C-test as an external measurement of reading ability and general language proficiency. And we correlated all these 3 measurements with each other. And strangely enough, the teacher-learner correlation was 0.8. The teacher C-test correlation was 0.8. The learner C-test correlation was 0.8. These are not the exact ones, but they approached 0.8, which is most valid. So this was, for me, is also a big surprise.
And that's across the classes. That's across the German and the Danish.
Absolutely, across the class. Okay. Right. Yes.
Okay, so in other words, to bottom line it, the learners' assessments of their own abilities and change of their abilities in these different areas that we've talked about is equally as valid as an external or 2 external tests that you applied.
Yes. Yes.
Wow.
We also Leni, whenever at the end of the year, Leni asks them, what do you think you should get in this or that area? And in almost all cases, learners underestimated their performance a bit. Leni's assessment scores slightly better than the learners themselves thought of themselves. I mean, that was also some kind of humility that comes in here. Yes.
So this is as the result of, we assume, the more kind of authentic, meaningful dialogue that's going on here, because the language that's being used in the classroom is being derived from them, from the learners in the Danish class, rather than from an external source, rather than from a textbook. Okay, so that's quite a powerful message there.
I hardly dared make it public because it's so unbelievable.
Okay, it seems kind of heretical in a way. Right. Okay. So that's as far as the explicit instruction, implicit acquisition debates is concerned. Do you think it's resolved as far as your...
Absolutely. Well, in this context, what happens in classrooms nowadays? 2 days ago, that was the 1st of Advent, I was together with my grandchildren. And I asked them, well, what is it that comes to your mind first when you think of your English classes? I'll give you the adjectives: boring, monotonous, we don't learn anything. One even said totally unnecessary. We haven't learned since grade 5 when we started learning English, more or less. It was so frustrating. Then I watched the 15-year-old. I watched him while he was watching the NFL American football match live. And he could choose between the German commentary and the English one. And he chose, the 15-year-old chose the English commentary. I said, Len, well, why don't you use the German one? Well, the English commentary, there are these experts on it, whereas the German, they are just, talking rubbish. So he was able, this guy who's had a minute ago said English is, we don't learn anything, but his English is excellent. So I asked him, where do you learn your English? And he said, from YouTube.
Right.
Social media, gaming.
Yes.
But especially YouTube. And I was amazed. The frustrating experiences in the classroom, and the English is not bad at all. This reminds me also of the turn of the century. There was a special issue on foreign language learning in one of our quality journals, Praxis des Neusprachlingsunterrichts. And the headline was, the foreign language classroom hasn't changed for the last 100 years. Hasn't changed in any qualitative way. I would go on and say not, and the last 2 decades it hasn't changed either.
Yeah.
So when it comes to the future of foreign language learning teaching, we have to make more efforts to spread the word of autonomous language learning.
Well, I mean, that's what we're here trying to do right now. And at the end of this chapter, chapter 5, you talk about action research, or for teachers to get involved and to do their own research in their classrooms. So, we're talking about making learning more relevant to people, like that you were just mentioning right now. What advice do you have for teachers that do want to follow in your footsteps and kind of investigate
Yes.
autonomy in their own context. You said you hadn't found two teachers yourself to replicate this this
Right.
study that you've done, the LALA project, but maybe you can give some advice for people that are listening.
I wouldn't use the term action research when talking to these teachers.
Okay.
I'd scare them off immediately. My first piece of advice would be, have you ever considered using a logbook yourself? Where you specify the plan for the day, and afterwards you question yourself what was good, what was bad, and why. So start with very, 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 very small steps at the beginning, and introducing the logbook for learners who wanted to learn foreign language is also the most important tool they use in the learning process, but also the teachers. They should also use logbooks, and that is the beginning of action research.
So this is it. This is the documenting of what's going on, and the reflection, and bridging the gap between the intention and the action.
Yes,
and
it would force you to reflect on
Right.
what was happening in the classroom.
Okay.
Not
I think
and just start playing tennis also.
No, as one piece of advice, I think that's pretty relevant. That's a good one. Okay, so that was the chapter number 5. So there was a lot of kind of quantitative analysis in terms of vocabulary, grammar, pragmatic competence, and then the reliability of those different assessments. And then now I think we're ready to jump back and meet this character again that you mentioned before was Dennis, and then another one, Susan. This is getting into chapter 6 of the book. So there's a very different kind of evidence presented in this chapter, but it's nice. It complements the 5th chapter quite well. Yes, can you talk a little bit about who Dennis and Susan are?
Okay, let's start with Susan. When in the very first English lesson, when the teacher was only speaking English, Susan burst out into tears. She couldn't follow what was going on in the classroom. And she was so frustrated, and she seemed to lack self-confidence in the first place. And the first texts that Susan wrote, I couldn't decipher them. I couldn't interpret them at all, because there was a mixture of Danish and perhaps also an English word, but even her Danish words were just messed up in a way. So it turned out that she was a heavy dyslexic learner. And in the first couple of weeks, though, she just returned to her favorite subject, horses. She was only talking about riding, about her horse, and so that was her interest. So what can one do with a dyslexic learner with a lack of self-esteem? And so Leni didn't do it deliberately, but we know how can we strengthen someone's self-esteem. Respect her, put trust in what she is doing, tell her that she is good enough for this or that, and so support her self-esteem by these various measures. Feel secure in your learning environment. This is so important. Feel secure. And if one watches Susan on one of Leni's videos, where they talk about a trip to England and how they want to prepare it, and there is a conversation between Susan and her classmate about culture, and the classmate says, well, I would like to focus on fashion. And Susan says, what kind of fashion? And she acts like a teacher in that conversation, full of self-confidence. And it's amazing how a dyslexic learner who would go to a special needs school in Germany, how a special needs learner bloomed in that. Can you say that? Bloomed?
Yes, yes, absolutely.
In that environment. And her last texts, if you just detract orthographic errors, perfect text she came up with, coherent and yeah, excellent text. But we know that with a dyslexic learner, dyslexia cannot be cured. So it will remain with you for a lifelong time. But Susan, in her oral performance, in the last state exam, she was excellent.
Wow.
So this is for me one of the big successes that one can think of.
Right. So that's kind of this ability to be inclusive of what we call SEN or SEND students.
We have published an article on is the answer to inclusion. Yeah, there is a big overlap between what is said within the inclusive pedagogy and autonomous language learning. That is big overlap. Right. We want the same things.
Sure. Okay. All right. So that's Susan. And then how about the second character that's raised in the book, Dennis?
Dennis. Well, as I said, well, he was copying in the very first lesson sentences that did not make any sense. Now, Dennis was a difficult student, so later on was expelled from school for disciplinary reasons. And at some stages, certain close classmates also didn't work together with him because he was disruptive. He couldn't focus on topics, and he was provocative in many ways. But in a way, he also had a creative side. And when I wanted to interview students, who would like to get interviewed? Dennis was the first to raise his hand, and I interviewed him. So he was interested in English. And in other school subjects, apart from math, he didn't get along at all. His Danish teacher was frustrated. But Dennis was interested in English. And when one of the class projects, one group of learners wanted to make a video on Dennis the Menace, this cartoon figure, Dennis the Menace.
Yep, I know it well.
Dennis, of all learners, he said, yeah, I'd like to be the protagonist. I'll be Dennis the Menace. So it was a classroom culture in which a learner like Dennis could also flourish. But unfortunately, he was expelled from school, as I said. And later on, he was successful, a businessman. He established his own carpentry.
No, you mentioned that's kind of good to hear that you kind of had the follow-up.
These are amazing stories. We actually started a second LALE project where we decided to follow the linguistic development of 6 learners from year 1 till the end of their school career. And we chose very weak learners, very gifted learners, and average learners, 2 of each cohort. Unfortunately, we couldn't follow up this project after a year or so. They had to give up that class, and we could not continue that project. That was a shame.
Mm.
but that would supplement our data and our findings.
Right. That's one of the problems with doing longitudinal research.
Right. Yeah.
Right. I suppose.
Yes.
So what particularly do you attribute Dennis's success in that class to? Which part of the autonomy classroom was it, do you think, that helped him kind of find some meaning in it?
I think one of the big assets of this approach is that learners can make their own choices. And Dennis could choose what he was interested in. He was not interested in that much, but I think that is one of the reasons why he did quite well in this. He was a weak student. He was a weak student, yes. But thinking in terms of what he actually did in other school subjects, he did very well in English. Let's say it like this. Although he did not become an excellent student, no.
Right. But within his realm of what was possible.
Yes, right. Within his limits.
Did he work well with other students?
Yes and no. Some learners did not want to work with him, but there were some girls who said, yeah, come on, we'll work with you. So, yes, with some students, he could work together quite well. Yeah, but that's, of course, where Leni could answer this question in somewhat more detail, because she could watch that every day.
Right.
I only at certain times.
Right, you had a few interactions with him.
Right.
But those individual portraits you've painted there of Susan and Dennis are quite they kind of personalize the data that's presented in the 5th chapter about the cohort as a whole. So it's quite powerful.
Yes.
Right? So it's a good answer to that seemingly simplistic question I asked much earlier at the start of our conversation. Does autonomy work? And it seems yes there. So you mentioned the second Lala project. You didn't manage to make that come through. But if you were to give some future researchers or people that are at the start of their career some advice about following in your footsteps there, what would it be?
Well, as I mentioned, choose a subject of your interest at the university, excel in that subject, and if you have excelled, then look out for vacancies for university jobs in your future. You cannot, Tom, you cannot plan a university career. So I cannot give any advice to students who would like to follow in these footsteps.
That's true.
It's not plannable. Do the best in your subject, and if you excel, then look out for vacancies and scholarships and whatever. So there is no plan for that. There is no route of success or whatever.
That's true. It occurs to me that your background is in computers and the use of technology as well in the analysis of language change. So just in closing, I wondered if you had any thoughts about technology and autonomy. Is there any useful overlap there?
Yes, as you can see in our book, there is hardly any talk about technology. Because I think the basic principles of autonomous language learning can almost do without technology. It's the social interaction between learners that is the most decisive element. And then what I haven't mentioned, what makes the autonomous classroom different from traditional mainstream communicative classrooms is that in the autonomous classroom, the learning processes are made learning content. Learning processes are made learning content. And if our teachers would grasp that, that this is the beginning of having learners, getting them to reflect on what they are doing. And that is one of the main features, I would say. And it's not just our basic idea. This was, as far as I can remember, first mentioned by Michael Breen. Mike Breen, working together with Chris Cadland. And Mike Breen, in many respects, has already published ideas similar to what we believe in today, the process syllabus. That is his term, that the syllabus evolves in interaction with the learners. And it's not a preset syllabus that has to be taken into consideration, yes, but the real syllabus is a process syllabus that evolves, as I said, in interaction with learners.
Right. And yes, and I think that is a really important message there about just making it about those interactions between people, making the learning process, the content of the learning, and maybe the technology can just get in the way of that kind of interaction, right? So yeah, no, that's a good message, I think. Well, I think I've taken enough of your time, but thank you very much. This was a fascinating conversation. So Lienhard Legenhausen, thank you very much.